At 14:47 on the afternoon of December 19, 1944, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Mueller stood in a frozen Belgian forest 3 kilometers east of Bastogne, with his hand resting on the cold armor of his Panther tank, staring through his binoculars at something that made absolutely no sense. 34 years old, veteran of the Eastern Front, survivor of Kursk, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division's 7th Company, and in this moment looking at what his mind refused to accept as real. Through the trees, down in the valley where American forces had established a supply depot 2 days before the German offensive began, Mueller counted fuel drums. Not dozens, not hundreds. He stopped counting at 3,000 because his hands started shaking. The depot spread across an area roughly 400 meters by 600 meters. Stacks of jerry cans arranged in rows, so precise they looked like city blocks. Fuel trucks parked in formations of 20, 30, 40 vehicles. And in the center, 6 massive fuel storage tanks, each one larger than anything Mueller had ever seen in 2 years of fighting across Russia. His gunner, Unterscharführer Hans Weber, climbed up beside him and asked what they were looking at. Mueller handed him the binoculars without speaking. Weber looked, lowered the binoculars, looked again, then turned to Mueller with an expression that perfectly matched what Mueller was feeling: pure disbelief. Weber asked if that was actually all fuel. Mueller nodded. Weber asked how much fuel that represented. Mueller did the mathematics in his head. Each jerry can held 20 liters. Conservative estimate, 3,000 cans visible from this position. Probably twice that number hidden behind the stacks. That was 120,000 liters just in the cans, not counting the trucks or the storage tanks. The Panther carried 730 liters of fuel. Full tank gave them roughly 200 kilometers of operational range on roads, maybe 85 kilometers cross-country. The fuel depot Mueller was looking at could fill his Panther 164 times over, and that was just the visible portion, just the jerry cans. Weber asked how long it would take the Americans to accumulate that much fuel. Mueller had no answer because the answer made no sense. The 2nd Panzer Division's entire monthly fuel allocation for all 27 operational tanks was approximately 145,000 liters. What Mueller was looking at in that valley represented more fuel than his entire division received in a month, and this was just one American supply depot, one of dozens scattered across Belgium and France, and the Americans had built it in less than a week. If you want to see how Klaus Mueller's discovery of American logistics superiority changed his understanding of why Germany was losing the war, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten perspectives from the other side of history. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're bringing you stories that don't make it into the textbooks. Back to Mueller and that fuel depot that shouldn't exist. Mueller had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939. He had driven a Panzer III through France in 1940, through the opening stages of Barbarossa in 1941, survived the winter outside Moscow, when temperatures dropped to -40 and half his unit froze to death in their tanks because they had no winter clothing and no antifreeze for the engines. He had fought at Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where the Germans assembled 2,928 tanks and assault guns for one massive offensive that was supposed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in a giant pincer movement. Mueller had watched that offensive collapse after 9 days because the Soviets had more tanks, more men, more artillery, and most critically, more fuel to keep everything moving. After Kursk, Mueller understood something that many German officers refused to accept. Germany was not losing because of tactics or courage or training. Germany was losing because of mathematics. The Soviet Union could build tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The United States could produce aircraft faster than German factories could make ammunition to shoot them down. And now, in December 1944, standing in a Belgian forest, looking at enough fuel to keep his entire division operational for a month, Mueller understood the final piece of the equation: logistics. America had more of everything, and they could move it anywhere they wanted, whenever they wanted, in quantities that made German supply operations look like a village market compared to a factory. The 2nd Panzer Division had begun the Ardennes offensive, what the Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, on December 16th, with 27 operational Panther tanks and 13 Panzer IVs. Good numbers for December 1944, when most German divisions were lucky to have 15 working tanks. The division's fuel allocation for the offensive was supposed to last 4 days of combat operations. After that, the plan called for German units to capture American fuel depots and use enemy supplies to continue the advance. Mueller had listened to that briefing on December 14th and said nothing because saying what he thought would have gotten him court-martialed. The plan assumed American fuel depots would be lightly guarded and easily captured. The plan assumed Americans would abandon supplies during retreat. The plan assumed fuel would be compatible with German engines, and that captured supplies would be sufficient to sustain an offensive involving 3 entire armies. Mueller had fought Americans in France during the summer. He knew they did not abandon supplies. He knew they did not retreat in panic, and he knew their logistics were something Germany had never seen before, not in Poland, not in France, not in Russia. But orders were orders. And at 0530 hours on December 16th, Mueller's company had crossed the start line and begun advancing west through the Ardennes forest. The first day went well. German forces achieved tactical surprise. American units were overrun or fell back. Mueller's company advanced 12 kilometers and destroyed 3 American M4 Sherman tanks without losing a single Panther. Fuel consumption was higher than expected because the terrain was worse than the map suggested, but they were still within acceptable parameters. December 17th was harder. American resistance stiffened. Mueller's company encountered a roadblock defended by American engineers who had blown a bridge and fortified the approach. It took 4 hours to clear the position. By the time they resumed the advance, they had covered only 8 kilometers. Fuel was becoming a concern. December 18th, the company advanced 6 kilometers. 2 Panthers broke down with transmission problems. Fuel was now critical. Mueller's tank had less than a quarter tank remaining, roughly 180 liters. Enough for maybe 40 kilometers on roads, 20 kilometers cross-country. And they were 60 kilometers from their start line with no resupply available. That's when the division commander issued new orders: scout for American fuel depots, capture supplies, continue the offensive. Mueller's company was tasked with reconnaissance in the Bastogne sector. Find fuel, take fuel, report locations of major supply concentrations. On the morning of December 19th, Mueller's Panther was running on fumes. The fuel gauge read less than 1/8 of a tank, maybe 90 liters remaining. Weber calculated they had enough fuel for 10, maybe 12 kilometers before they became a stationary pillbox. At 1320 hours, they spotted smoke rising from a valley 3 kilometers east. Mueller took the Panther off the road and into the forest, moving slowly to conserve fuel. At 1447 hours, they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, and Mueller saw the American fuel depot that would permanently change his understanding of the war. The depot was not lightly guarded. Mueller counted at least 60 American soldiers visible from his position, probably more in the buildings and trucks. The Americans had established a perimeter with machine gun positions and what looked like anti-aircraft guns, probably 40mm Bofors, which could be deadly against tanks at close range. The depot was not abandoned. Americans were actively working, moving supplies, organizing fuel drums, directing traffic. Trucks were coming and going on a road that connected to the main highway running south toward Bastogne. The depot was not temporary. The Americans had built structures, wooden buildings, probably offices and storage facilities. They had bulldozed the ground flat and laid down metal matting for vehicle parking. They had created a functioning installation in the middle of a combat zone in less than a week, and they had filled it with more fuel than Mueller's entire division used in a month. Weber asked if they should attack. Mueller asked if Weber had lost his mind. One tank, less than 90 liters of fuel, against 60 American soldiers with anti-tank weapons and machine guns, and even if they somehow captured the depot, then what? They had no way to transport the fuel. They had no infantry support to hold the position. They had no radio contact with division headquarters because the radio had malfunctioned that morning. Attacking would accomplish nothing except getting them killed and losing a Panther that the division could not replace. Mueller made his decision. They would observe, gather intelligence, withdraw, and report. If division wanted that depot captured, they could send a proper force with infantry and support. Mueller and his crew spent 40 minutes watching the American depot. Mueller took notes, estimated fuel quantities, vehicle counts, guard positions, approach routes, defensive emplacements. At 15:30 hours, something happened that made all of Mueller's calculations irrelevant. An American convoy arrived at the depot, 18 trucks, each one carrying fuel. Mueller watched through his binoculars as American soldiers began unloading the trucks. Each truck carried approximately 200 jerry cans. That was 3,600 cans total, 72,000 liters of fuel, arriving at a depot that already held more fuel than Mueller could accurately estimate. Weber asked where the Americans were getting all this fuel. Mueller had no answer. He knew the Americans were producing oil in Texas and California. He knew they had tanker ships bringing fuel across the Atlantic, but knowing it intellectually and seeing it physically were two different experiences. The scale was beyond anything Mueller had encountered. In Russia, German units sometimes waited weeks for fuel resupply. Mueller personally had experienced situations where his tank sat immobile for 10 days because no fuel was available. The division would receive a shipment, allocate it carefully, ration it to the tanks that needed it most for specific operations. Every liter was precious, every kilometer was calculated, every movement was planned around fuel availability. And here were the Americans unloading 72,000 liters of fuel at a depot that already overflowing, treating it like it was nothing special, just another routine delivery. At 15:47 hours, Mueller saw something that made him physically ill. An American soldier dropped a jerry can while moving it from a truck. The can hit the ground, the cap came loose, and fuel spilled out. Maybe 5 liters, maybe 10. The American soldier looked at the spill, shrugged, picked up the can, and walked away. No one tried to recover the spilled fuel. No one seemed concerned. They just left it there, on the ground, 10 liters of fuel that Mueller's tank desperately needed. Fuel that could give them another 2 kilometers of range, just sitting there soaking into the Belgian mud, because the Americans had so much fuel that 10 liters wasn't worth the effort to recover. Mueller had watched German soldiers drain fuel from wrecked vehicles, using hand pumps and buckets, crawling under burning tanks to siphon out whatever remained in the fuel lines because every liter mattered. He had personally supervised the collection of fuel from 3 destroyed Panzer IVs after a battle in Ukraine, spending 2 hours in the middle of winter to recover 140 liters total from all 3 tanks. And this American soldier just watched 10 liters spill and walked away. Weber said something in that moment that Mueller never forgot. Weber said, "We cannot win this war. Not we might not win. Not we are losing. We cannot win." Present tense, absolute statement, mathematical certainty. Mueller asked why Weber was saying this now. Weber pointed at the fuel depot and said, "If the Americans can waste more fuel in one spill than we spend in a day, if they can build a supply depot this size in a week, if they can deliver 72,000 liters to a single location like it's routine, then nothing we do matters. We can have better tanks, better tactics, better training, better soldiers. It doesn't matter. They have more of everything, and they can put it anywhere they want, whenever they want it. We are trying to fight mathematics with courage. It doesn't work. Mueller told Weber to be quiet, not because Weber was wrong, because Weber was right, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that Mueller was not ready to accept. At 16:15 hours, Mueller gave the order to withdraw. They had enough fuel to return to German lines if they moved carefully and avoided combat. The intelligence they had gathered was valuable. Division needed to know about this depot, needed to understand what they were facing. Mueller backed the Panther away from the ridge, kept the engine at low RPM to conserve fuel, and began the journey back. They made it 4 kilometers before the fuel ran out. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died at 17:03 hours on a forest trail 6 kilometers from friendly lines. Mueller climbed out of the Panther and stood beside his tank in the frozen forest and understood with perfect clarity that this was the war in miniature. Germany produced the Panther, one of the best tanks of the war, superior armor and firepower to almost anything the Allies fielded. But the Panther needed fuel, needed spare parts, needed ammunition, needed all the unglamorous logistics that kept a weapon system operational. And Germany could not provide those things in sufficient quantities anymore. The Americans could. The Americans had so much fuel they spilled it and didn't care. They had so many trucks that losing 10 or 20 to air attack or mechanical failure didn't matter. They had so much industrial capacity that they could build a supply depot in a week that held more supplies than an entire German division received in a month. Mueller and his crew abandoned the Panther. They removed the breech block from the main gun to disable it, drained the machine gun ammunition into their packs, and began walking east toward German lines. They walked through the night. At 03:20 hours on December 20th, they encountered a German patrol from the 9th Panzer Division. Mueller reported to the divisional headquarters at 06:40 hours and provided his intelligence on the American fuel depot. The intelligence officer listened to Mueller's report and asked if Mueller was certain about the fuel quantities. Mueller said he was conservative in his estimates. The actual amounts were probably higher. The intelligence officer asked if the depot was defended. Mueller said yes, approximately 60 soldiers, machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, proper perimeter. The intelligence officer asked if Mueller thought the depot could be captured. Mueller asked how many tanks and how much infantry the division was willing to commit. The intelligence officer said they had 19 operational tanks remaining and maybe 200 infantry who were not already engaged. Mueller said that was not enough. You would need at least 30 tanks and 500 infantry to have a reasonable chance, and even then you would take heavy casualties, and even if you captured it, you would have no way to move that much fuel forward because we don't have enough trucks, and the Americans would counterattack within hours because they have reserves and mobility that we don't have. The intelligence officer thanked Mueller for his report and dismissed him. Mueller never learned if anyone attempted to capture that depot. He spent the next 4 days at division headquarters because his tank was gone and no replacement was available. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. Allied aircraft appeared in force. Mueller watched American P-47 Thunderbolts fly overhead in formations of 12, 16, 20 aircraft. They were not flying combat patrol. They were flying logistics interdiction, attacking German supply columns, destroying trucks, strafing anything that moved on the roads. The Ardennes offensive was falling apart, not because German soldiers were not fighting, not because German tactics were wrong, because Germany could not sustain the logistics required for a major offensive in 1944. Fuel ran out, ammunition ran out. Tanks broke down and could not be repaired. Units became isolated and could not be resupplied. On December 26th, American forces broke the German encirclement of Bastogne. On January 8th, Hitler authorized withdrawal from the Ardennes. The offensive had failed. Germany had committed its last operational reserves and achieved nothing except depleting those reserves. Mueller was reassigned to a new tank, a Panzer IV, older and less capable than the Panther he had lost. The 2nd Panzer Division withdrew east. Through January and February and March of 1945, Mueller fought a series of delaying actions across Germany. The division shrank with every engagement. 19 operational tanks became 14, then 9, then 6. Fuel became increasingly scarce. There were days when tanks sat immobile because no fuel was available. There were battles where Mueller's company received 200 liters of fuel total for 3 tanks and had to decide which tanks would fight and which would stay behind. Mueller survived until April 10, 1945. On that date, near Uelzen in Lower Saxony, his Panzer IV was hit by American tank fire. The round penetrated the front armor and killed his driver instantly. Mueller and the surviving crew bailed out. They surrendered to American forces later that day. Mueller spent the next 3 years in a prisoner of war camp in France. During that time, he had many opportunities to think about what he had seen in December 1944, that American fuel depot that held more fuel than his entire division used in a month. He thought about the soldier who spilled 10 liters and walked away. He thought about Weber's words, "We cannot win this war. We are trying to fight mathematics with courage." In the camp, Mueller met other German soldiers from other units who had similar stories. A Luftwaffe pilot who had flown reconnaissance over Normandy in June 1944 and seen the beaches covered with American supplies stacked 10 meters high, stretching for kilometers. A Wehrmacht infantryman who had been captured in France and marched past an American supply depot that he estimated was 3 kilometers long. A U-boat commander who described trying to sink American supply ships in the Atlantic and realizing there were so many ships that sinking 10 or 20 made no difference to the overall flow of supplies to Europe. Every story had the same theme. American logistics were overwhelming, unprecedented, operating on a scale that Germany could not match and had never anticipated. Mueller learned after the war that the United States had produced approximately 88,000 tanks during World War II. Germany produced approximately 49,000. The United States produced 324,000 aircraft. Germany produced 119,000, but the real disparity was not in weapons. It was in everything that supported the weapons. The United States produced 2.4 million trucks during the war. Germany produced 345,000. The United States built 6,500 cargo ships. Germany built maybe 1,200 military transport vessels total, most of them small coastal craft. The United States laid 72,000 kilometers of oil pipeline across Europe to move fuel from ports to frontline units. Germany relied on trains and horse-drawn carts for most of its logistics. The American military consumed approximately 17 million liters of fuel per day at peak operations in 1944. The entire German Wehrmacht, all branches, all fronts, consumed approximately 7 million liters per day when supplies were good, which was rare after 1942. Mueller was released from the POW camp in 1948. He returned to Germany and found a country in ruins. He worked construction, rebuilding buildings that had been destroyed during the war. He married in 1951. He rarely spoke about his military service. But in 1973, a historian from the University of Munich was researching German perspectives on American logistics during World War II. The historian had obtained Mueller's name from Wehrmacht records and wrote to ask if Mueller would be willing to be interviewed. Mueller agreed. The interview took place over 3 days in October 1973. The historian asked Mueller about many things, about battles and tactics and weapons. But the part of the interview that became most famous, the part that was quoted in 3 subsequent books about World War II logistics, was when the historian asked Mueller to describe the moment when he knew Germany would lose the war. Mueller described standing on that ridge on December 19, 1944, looking at the American fuel depot through his binoculars, watching that soldier spill 10 liters of fuel and walk away. Mueller said that was the moment, not because of the fuel itself, because of what the fuel represented. The Americans had built a military machine so large, so productive, so logistically capable that they could afford to waste resources. Germany could not afford to waste anything. Every liter, every bullet, every piece of equipment was precious because there was never enough. And when you are fighting an enemy who has so much of everything that they can afford to be wasteful, you cannot win. It is mathematics. The historian asked if Mueller thought German soldiers had fought well. Mueller said German soldiers fought superbly. German tactics were often superior. German weapons, in many cases, were better than Allied equivalents. The Panther was a better tank than the Sherman in almost every measurable way. But the Americans had 5 Shermans for every Panther, and when the Panther ran out of fuel, it didn't matter how good it was. The historian asked if better logistics could have changed the outcome for Germany. Mueller said no. Germany's logistics were not bad because of incompetence or poor planning. They were bad because Germany did not have the resources. Germany did not have the oil. Germany did not have the industrial capacity. Germany did not have the trucks and trains and ships to move supplies, even if supplies had been available. The Soviet Union had oil fields in the Caucasus. The United States had oil fields in Texas and California and Oklahoma. Germany had synthetic fuel plants that were bombed repeatedly and could never produce enough. Geography and resources determined the war's outcome long before the first shot was fired. Tactics and courage could change individual battles. They could not change the fundamental equation. The historian asked what Mueller remembered most about the war. Mueller said he remembered the American fuel depot. He remembered counting drums and cans and trucks and storage tanks and realizing he was looking at more fuel than his entire division received in a month. He remembered the soldier who spilled fuel and walked away. And he remembered Weber saying, "We cannot win this war. We are trying to fight mathematics with courage." The interview was published in 1974 as part of a larger oral history project. Mueller's account became one of the most cited examples of German recognition of Allied logistic superiority. Several military historians used Mueller's description of the fuel depot to illustrate the scale disparity between American and German supply operations. In 1978, a logistician at the U.S. Army War College used Mueller's story in a lecture on the importance of logistics in modern warfare, pointing out that the United States had won World War II, not primarily through superior tactics or technology, but through superior ability to deliver overwhelming quantities of supplies to the right place at the right time. Mueller lived until 1991. He died at age 81 in Hamburg. He had spent the last 20 years of his life working with a German veterans organization that focused on reconciliation and historical education. He spoke at schools occasionally, talking to students about the war. His message was always the same. War is not about heroism and glory. War is about logistics and mathematics. The side that can produce more, transport more, supply more, will win. Tactics matter. Leadership matters. But they matter within the constraints of what your logistics can support. Germany in World War II had excellent tactics and leadership, but it could not overcome the logistical disparity. The United States and Soviet Union simply had more of everything, and they could deliver it where it was needed. After Mueller's death, his family donated his papers to the German Federal Archives. Among those papers was a small notebook Mueller had kept during the war. The notebook contained daily entries, brief observations, technical notes. The entry for December 19, 1944, was longer than most. Mueller had written a detailed description of the American fuel depot, including his estimates of fuel quantities and his observations about American logistics. At the bottom of the entry, Mueller had written one sentence that he had not shared during the 1973 interview, one sentence that captured his feelings in that moment on the ridge overlooking the valley. Mueller had written, "We are not fighting a war. We are fighting an industrial empire, and we have nothing to match it. That notebook is now part of the permanent collection at the German Federal Archives in Berlin. Historians and researchers can view it by appointment. The entry for December 19, 1944, has been photographed and reproduced in several books about German perspectives on World War II. The American fuel depot that Mueller observed was almost certainly part of the Red Ball Express supply operation or one of its successor operations. The Red Ball Express was a massive truck convoy system that operated from August to November 1944, delivering supplies from Normandy beaches to frontline units advancing across France. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved 6,000 trucks operating around the clock, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies per day. After the Red Ball Express officially ended, similar operations continued under different names. The depot Mueller saw in December 1944 was likely a forward fuel storage point for one of these operations, positioned to support American forces in the Ardennes region. Army logistics records from December 1944 indicate that the U.S. First Army, which was operating in the Ardennes sector, had over 40 major fuel depots in Belgium and Luxembourg, each holding between 200,000 and 600,000 liters of fuel. The depot Mueller observed, based on his estimates, was probably on the smaller end of that range, possibly holding 300,000 to 400,000 liters total, when the storage tanks and trucks are included with the jerry cans. To put that in perspective, the entire Africa Corps under Rommel in 1942 often operated with a total fuel reserve of less than 500,000 liters for all units combined, and shortages below that level caused operational paralysis. The Americans had that much fuel at a single depot, one of more than 40 in the region, and they were receiving regular resupply deliveries. The logistical disparity was exactly as extreme as Mueller perceived it to be. American logistics in Europe during World War II represented the largest and most complex supply operation in military history up to that time. The scale is difficult to comprehend without looking at specific numbers. From D-Day in June 1944 to VE Day in May 1945, American forces in Europe consumed approximately 18 million tons of supplies. That included fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and everything else required to sustain military operations. To move those supplies, the U.S. military operated over 200,000 trucks in Europe by early 1945. The famous Red Ball Express was just one of many truck convoy systems. Others included the White Ball Express, the ABC Hall, the Red Lion Express, and several others, each moving thousands of tons of supplies daily. The United States also built extensive port facilities to receive supplies from America. By the end of 1944, American engineers had repaired and expanded ports in France to handle over 40,000 tons of cargo per day. They built pipelines across France to move fuel directly from ports to supply depots, eliminating the need for trucks on those routes and freeing up transportation capacity for other supplies. They constructed railroads, repaired bridges, built temporary roads, and created an entire logistics infrastructure from scratch in less than a year. Germany had nothing comparable. German logistics in World War II relied heavily on railways, which were vulnerable to air attack and could not operate flexibly across rapidly changing front lines. German truck production never met requirements, and fuel shortages meant that even existing trucks often sat idle. German logistics could support defensive operations relatively well, where supply lines were short and positions were static. But German logistics could not support sustained offensive operations by 1944 because offensive operations required mobility, flexibility, and high fuel consumption, all things that German supply systems could not provide in sufficient quantities. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 was Germany's attempt to prove that one more offensive could change the war's trajectory. The operation assembled Germany's last significant reserves, achieved tactical surprise, and initially made good progress. But the offensive failed primarily because German logistics could not sustain it. Units ran out of fuel within days, supplies could not reach frontline formations. American logistics, by contrast, responded rapidly to the crisis, rerouting supplies, shifting units, establishing new depots, and maintaining operational tempo even during the defensive phase of the battle. Mueller's observation of that single American fuel depot was his window into understanding this larger reality. He was looking at one small piece of an enormous machine. But that one piece was enough to reveal the scale of what Germany was fighting against. The soldier who spilled 10 liters of fuel and walked away was not careless or wasteful by American standards. He was operating in a logistics environment where 10 liters was genuinely insignificant, where the system produced and delivered fuel in such quantities that minor losses were not worth the time to recover. That same 10 liters would have been carefully collected and saved in any German unit, because German logistics operated at the margin, where every liter mattered, where losses could not be absorbed, where scarcity was the constant reality. The contrast between those two logistics realities, American abundance versus German scarcity, determined the war's outcome as much as any battle or campaign. If you found this perspective valuable, if Klaus Mueller's realization helped you understand World War II from a different angle, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to share this story with more people who need to understand that wars are not won just with courage and tactics. Wars are won with logistics, production, resources, and the ability to deliver overwhelming quantities of supplies to the fight. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are bringing you these perspectives every day, stories from soldiers on all sides who saw the reality of industrial warfare. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. United States, Germany, United Kingdom, Canada, anywhere in the world. Our community is global, and you are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if this changed how you think about World War II. Tell us if someone in your family served in any military during any war. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Klaus Mueller's story does not disappear into forgotten archives. These perspectives deserve to be remembered because they teach us that war is ultimately about mathematics and logistics, and the side that understands that reality has an advantage that courage alone cannot overcome.